You know, another one of those dry reports full of jargon.
Right.
This one comes from some really sharp minds over at the Joint Research Center and the International Energy Agency.
Okay.
And what makes it so useful is they've gone to great lengths to track emissions across every single country in a way that's actually comparable.
Okay, so we're not talking about comparing apples to oranges here.
Exactly.
That's good because, I'll be honest, I need some clarity on this whole emissions situation.
This report, it's called GHG Emissions of All World Countries, and it uses a consistent methodology. So we can finally see the global trends without, any of that statistical smoke and mirrors.
Music to my ears. So what's the headline? What's the big takeaway from all this data crunching?
Well, remember how back during the COVID lockdowns, everyone was talking about emissions dipping?
Yeah.
Almost like the planet was getting a little breather.
Right.
Turns out that was short-lived. Global greenhouse gas emissions in 2022 hit a record high 53.8 gigatons of CO2 equivalent.
Whoa, 53.8 gigatons. Okay, help me wrap my head around that. What does that even look like?
Imagine a stack of coal so massive it could cover the entire country of France. That's roughly the amount of CO2 equivalent we released into the atmosphere, in just 1 year.
Wow.
And that's actually a 1.4% increase compared to 2021.
Okay, so much for that whole planet getting a break thing. That's pretty alarming. So who are the biggest culprits driving this emissions surge?
Well, the usual suspects are still at the top: China, the US, and India.
Okay.
Together, these three countries, they account for a hefty 61.6% of global emissions.
Wow.
But here's where things get really interesting. Their emissions stories are actually quite different.
Oh, I love a good plot twist. Give me the deets.
Let's start with China. Their emissions have almost quadrupled since 1990.
Quadrupled. Seriously?
Yes, seriously.
Wow.
You see, China's rapid industrialization has been fueled largely by coal, and it's come at, a steep environmental cost.
Right.
In 2022 alone, their emissions increased by 0.3% compared to the previous year.
Okay.
Now, that might sound small, but it adds up when you're already a top emitter.
Yeah, that puts things into perspective. So what about the U.S.? Are we doing any better?
The U.S. saw a 1.6% rise in emissions in 2022.
Okay.
Now, before you get too discouraged, there is a silver lining. Their overall emissions are actually lower compared to 1990, which is, a step in the right direction.
Okay.
However, that decline has been much slower compared to, say, the European Union.
Speaking of the EU, it seems like they're the only ones actually making significant progress. What's their secret sauce?
The EU is a fascinating case study. They're the only major player whose emissions in 2022 were actually lower than they were back in 1990. A significant 27% lower, to be precise.
Wow, that's impressive. How did they manage that?
Well, they've taken this multi-pronged approach,
Heck.
investing heavily in renewable energy sources like wind and solar.
Yeah.
And they've also been implementing some pretty ambitious climate policies.
So the EU is like the star student in the global emissions class.
In a lot of ways, yes.
Yeah.
But it's not all smooth sailing. Remember that whole energy crisis triggered by the war in Ukraine?
No, right.
Yeah, that's put them in a difficult position. They're trying to balance their climate goals with the need for reliable energy, especially after reducing their dependence on Russian gas.
That sounds like a tough balancing act. It's like they're trying to juggle flaming torches while walking a tightrope.
That's one way to put it. It really highlights the complexity of tackling climate change. There are often these competing priorities and tough choices to be made.
It's definitely not a simple fix. Okay, we've covered the big players, China, the US, and the EU. What about everyone else? Any surprises in the report?
Absolutely. The report also dives into the emissions trends of other significant emitters like Russia and Brazil. Russia's emissions, for instance, are like riding a roller coaster.
A roller coaster. I'm intrigued. Tell me more.
So their emissions plummeted after the fall of the Soviet Union, but now they're back on the rise again. A big reason for this is their heavy dependence on fossil fuels,
Right.
which, continue to be a major source of energy for them.
So it's almost like their emissions mirror their economic situation.
Yeah.
It makes you wonder, is there even a way to have economic growth without increasing emissions?
That's the million-dollar question economists and policymakers are grappling with right now.
Yeah.
Is there a way to decouple economic growth from emissions, or are we destined to repeat these patterns?
Right.
It's a conversation that deserves its own deep dive, for sure.
Agreed. But for now, let's stick with this report. We've talked about individual countries, but I'm curious about the bigger picture. What are some of the overarching trends that stood out to you?
One thing that really struck me was just how quickly Global emissions bounced back after that brief dip during COVID.
Yeah.
Remember, they grew faster in 2021 and 2022 than in the entire decade leading up to the pandemic.
Wow, that's like hitting the gas instead of the brakes after a temporary slowdown. It really highlights how critical it is to, find more sustainable ways of living and transition to cleaner energy sources.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And speaking of sustainable practices, the report also sheds light on something that's, I think, often overlooked in these discussions.
Okay.
The role of forests in all of this.
Yeah, trees.
Yeah.
It's easy to forget they play a huge role in this whole carbon emissions game.
Right. They're not just pretty scenery,
Right.
They're incredibly dynamic when it comes to absorbing and releasing CO2.
Okay, so walk me through this. What's the good news when it comes to forests and emissions?
Well, the good news is that managed forests, those actively cared for by humans,
Right.
are like these giant lungs sucking up huge amounts of CO2. Think of them as massive carbon sinks.
So we're talking about forests that are being, managed responsibly. That's encouraging. How much CO2 are we talking about here?
Get this, in 2022 alone, these managed forests absorbed an estimated 5.2 gigatons of CO2. To put that into perspective, that's roughly equivalent to 13.9% of global fossil fuel emissions.
Wow, that's a pretty significant chunk. So it sounds like planting trees and managing forests sustainably, that's crucial in the fight against climate change. But I'm guessing there's a catch?
Well, you're right, there's a flip side of this coin.
Okay.
While managed forests are doing their part, deforestation is throwing a wrench in the works.
Deforestation, that's the clearing of forests for things like agriculture and development, right?
Exactly. And it's a major source of emissions. You see, when trees are cut down or burned, they release that stored carbon back into the atmosphere.
So it's like we're taking 2 steps forward with sustainable forestry, but then taking a step back with deforestation.
Precisely. And the numbers are concerning. In 2022, deforestation alone contributed a staggering 4 gigatons of CO2 emissions. That's a whopping 10.4% of total human-caused CO2 emissions.
Wow, those numbers paint a stark picture. It's like trying to fill a bathtub with the drain open.
Right.
It's clear that protecting existing forests is just as important as planting new trees.
Absolutely. We need this multi-pronged approach, sustainable land management, reforestation efforts, and policies that actually incentivize forest conservation.
Right.
It's a complex issue. No easy solutions. It requires like a true global effort.
Yeah. It sounds like we need to be much more mindful of how we use land and manage our forests if we're serious about tackling this crisis. What I'm hearing is that every tree counts.
You got it. And that's where this report's focus on clear and consistent data is so crucial. By having comparable data on emissions from like land use and forestry across the board, we can pinpoint the drivers of deforestation and tailor solutions that actually make a difference.
It's like having a global emissions map, allowing us to zoom in on the problem areas and take targeted action. Now, we've covered the ups and downs of forests and emissions, but I'm curious about something you mentioned earlier. This report's emphasis on improved emissions accounting. What's that all about?
Oh, that's a really important point. The report, it kind of highlights a disconnect in how we track emissions, particularly when it comes to land use and forestry.
A disconnect. Explain that. What do you mean?
Well, see, countries often report their emissions based on their own, national circumstances,
Okay.
using their own methods and definitions.
Okay, so different countries have different ways of measuring things. Makes sense. That's the problem with that.
The problem is, it makes it really difficult to compare apples to apples on a global scale.
Okay.
So on the one hand, you have countries reporting their emissions based on their own unique, frameworks.
Yeah.
On the other hand, you have global models, like the ones used by the IPCC, that are using different assumptions and calculations.
So it's not that anyone is intentionally trying to mislead anyone. It's just that everyone is speaking a different language when it comes to emissions data.
Exactly. And this can create a kind of data discrepancy, making it tough to get a truly accurate picture of global emissions.
That sounds like a recipe for confusion. What are the implications of this data discrepancy? Does it really matter if the numbers are a bit off?
It might sound like a minor detail, but it actually has big implications. If we're not comparing apples to apples, it becomes incredibly difficult to assess how we're actually doing in terms of, meeting climate goals.
It's like trying to bake a cake using 3 different measuring cups.
Right.
Each with its own quirky scale. You might end up with something that, resembles a cake,
Yeah,
but it's probably not going to be pretty.
that's a great way to put it. And just like a wonky cake, inaccurate emissions data,
Right.
can lead to some messy outcomes.
Yeah.
It can make it harder to craft effective policies, track our progress accurately, and
Right.
hold everyone accountable for their emissions.
So what can be done about this? How do we get everyone on the same page when it comes to emissions data?
That's the million-dollar question. This report really highlights, the urgent need for better, more standardized emissions accounting,
Okay.
particularly when it comes to things like land use and forestry.
So we need to establish a universal language for emissions data.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Imagine if we had this global system where everyone was using the same units of measurement, the same definitions, the same reporting methods.
Yeah.
That would be a game changer.
It would definitely make it much easier to see where we stand and, track our progress as a planet. It sounds like this report is kind of a wake-up call for, better data and greater transparency in how we tackle this whole crisis.
Absolutely. This report is more than just a collection of numbers,
Right.
It's a call to action. It's about recognizing the complexities, acknowledging the gaps in our knowledge, and working together to find solutions that are grounded in accurate, reliable data.
And on that note, this report left us with a pretty thought-provoking question, I thought.
Yeah, it really made me think about the inconsistencies in how we measure emissions,
Right.
particularly those from land use.
Yeah.
It begs the question, what does this discrepancy really mean for our understanding of how we're tracking against those big, ambitious climate goals?
Yeah.
Are we making more progress than the data suggests, or are we lagging behind?
Right.
And can we even find a way to get everyone on the same page when it comes to measuring our impact?
That's a question that deserves its own deep dive, for sure. Food for thought as we navigate this complex and ever-evolving challenge. Well, folks, there you have it. We've taken a deep dive into the world of global emissions, explored the good, the bad, and the downright alarming trends. And we grappled with some pretty big questions about, how we measure our impact on the planet.
Yeah, it's a complex landscape.
Yeah.
But by, understanding the nuances,
Right.
we can all be better equipped to make informed decisions and advocate for a more sustainable future.
Remember, knowledge is power. And the more we understand about the state of our planet, the better equipped we are to be part of the solution. Until next time, keep those questions coming,
Absolutely.
and we'll keep diving deep.